All right, welcome everyone. My name is Anna Smith, and I would like to welcome you to our first session in the 2024 Theory Method Speaker Series. I have some introductory remarks, and while I make them, I welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat. And you can find the chat button below, and then if you could toggle from where it says hosts to everyone, and you can go ahead and tell us who you are and where you're joining us from. We'll try to keep the chat open throughout the call, and so I'd ask you to be as productive as you can in the comments, just to make this a little more dialogic for those of you on the webinar side. So the Theory Method series comes to us from the Education Now Lab at Illinois State University in the School of Teaching and Learning. And the Education Now Lab is a community-engaged research practice lab that works with and produces a range of critical, interdisciplinary, public, academic, and new media scholarship with and alongside community members. And I'll share some of the links for where you can learn more about that lab, and then also sign up for the next two speakers in our series if you are interested. So I'll do that in just a minute. The series is sponsored by the Illinois State University Office of Research and Graduate Studies, and we thank them for the support. And in that, we recognize that we're working to make meaningful. The Illinois State University is built on the land and waters of multiple Indigenous nations who were forcibly removed, including the Illini, Peoria, and the Miami. And later, due to colonial encroachment and displacement, the Fox, Potawatomi, Sauk, Shawnee, Winnebago, Iowa, Muscotan, Piankashaw, Wea, and Kickapoo nations. And we also honor the Indigenous peoples who have been excluded due to historical erasure and inaccuracy. So, and as we're seeing currently in the sustained struggles and atrocities happening regarding peoples and lands in horrific current events, I hope we can dedicate our insights and energies that we gain from tonight toward action that's best for our mutual critical humanization. And to that end, I'm so pleased to welcome Johnny Saldaña tonight. He is a professor emeritus from Arizona State University's School of Film, Dance, and Theater. And if you have looked at a Qualitative Methods book, you might have seen his name. He's written the coding manual for qualitative researchers, Thinking Qualitatively, Methods of the Mind, Ethno-Theater, Research from Page to Stage, and a piece that has been so critical to my work, the Longitudinal Qualitative Research, Analyzing Change Through Time. So key to my own understanding change across time. Beautiful work. And Saldaña's qualitative methods work have been cited and referenced in more than 27,000 research studies conducted over 135 countries. And he's agreed to join us tonight to talk about designing conceptual frameworks for qualitative research studies. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over and thank you once again for joining us tonight.
Right. First of all, can my screen be seen, and is my voice coming across okay?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Right. So what we'll be doing this evening is taking a look at how you can develop a hypothetical study about identity in its broadest terms, and that can refer to things like teacher identity, student identity, gender identity. It will be your choice. We'll be using a three-part template to compose the three facets, the way I approach it with conceptual frameworks: the theoretical, the methodological, and the epistemological. Materials that you'll be needing: pencils or pens, have some text editing software like Microsoft Word or handwriting materials. You should also have received ahead of time the Conceptual Frameworks workbook file. Anna, if you have that available, if you could please post that in chat for people to download. A couple of understandings for our time together. Everybody has different background experiences in qualitative inquiry and data analysis. Nevertheless, I present with the assumption that most are newcomers to qualitative research design. So please transfer and adapt what I present for your own particular research needs. Due to our time limitations today, I can present only a selected, focused array of topics, and because of the number of participants, I may not be able to address all the questions or discussion topics that you might be posting. I saw this meme on Facebook one time, and I chuckled at it, so I present it to you as well. How to design a qualitative studies conceptual framework. First, outline some basic ideas. Expand a smaller idea, end up with some garbage. This garbage is like your life. It's a mess beyond solving, and nobody loves you. The conceptual framework seems to be a very difficult thing, and admittedly, when I first learned about qualitative inquiry in the 1990s, it took me about a year before I could really understand what a conceptual framework was all about. So what I'm presenting to you are my particular understandings of that. To me, the conceptual framework is a game plan for the study. It's kind of like the research design in condensed Reader's Digest form. The best metaphor that I found for it is an investigative architecture, and it suggests that you've thought through all the preliminary decisions carefully to make everything go together or unify. It's your assumptions about why the theories are going to drive your study, what particular qualitative genre for the research design is selected, and how the knowledge will be constructed. Now, these are the three components, and you'll see them in color all the way throughout this particular presentation. The conceptual framework is a narrative, sometimes a diagram, that consists of three facets: the theoretical, methodological, and epistemological premises about a study. And the other important thing to know is that a conceptual framework evolves throughout the study. You start and you end up with one. There are other terms in the literature, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but just keep in mind that when you read qualitative inquiry and methods books, you're going to be coming across terms like theoretical, analytical, critical, sensitizing, exploratory, validity, and explanatory frameworks. Each one is particularly different according to the person who is writing about the particular methodology. But for us, though, we're going to focus exclusively on conceptual frameworks. I once asked ChatGPT, which is, of course, very innovative and very prominent now in inquiry. I asked it, can ChatGPT develop a conceptual framework for a qualitative study? Now, this is what the platform wrote back. Yes, ChatGPT can help you develop a conceptual framework for a qualitative research study. And then it goes on to define what a conceptual framework is according to the platform's understandings. But most qualitative research studies are so topic and research question specific that ChatGPT can only offer you the most general of outlines if you prompt it to develop a conceptual framework for a qualitative research study about. So at this time, ChatGPT in all its variants cannot quite develop that conceptual framework. It still needs the human touch. A couple of analogies to help you grasp it. Just as a map is not a journey, what it does, though, is prepare you and guide you toward a destination. And so that's one analogy for conceptual framework. Another analogy is to think of it as a device with a GPS app that voices aloud to you, turn right, proceed forward, stop ahead, and all those other specific navigational prompts. So what you're doing is you're driving to a specific destination with your research study. And what this GPS app as a conceptual framework does is guide and advise you along the way about how to get there. One more analogy. A conceptual framework is a compass, not an anchor, because the anchor roots you down and doesn't permit you to move anywhere. But the compass is something that guides you as you're going and progressing forward. So keep these analogies in mind, and there'll be more presented later on. Since I come from a department of theater and film, I use film as a pedagogical tool. And from The Big Bang Theory, which is a TV series about researchers, there was one episode called The Herb Garden Germination. There are going to be three conceptual framework premises illustrated in this scene. First of all, the theoretical. This consists of the main ideas that serve as the foundation for your inquiry. It's usually most often the literature review, which is the primary source for finding out about the major schools of thought about your research topic. The methodological premises illustrates why and how you're going to investigate your topic in a particular way. So that this might refer to, for example, methodologies like phenomenology, grounded theory, narrative inquiry, and so forth. The epistemological premises refer to how you perceive and experience the social world and how you're going to construct the knowledge about that. In other words, this primarily refers to your data generation, collection, and your data analysis. So the three facets of a conceptual framework, think of it as a Venn diagram in which they are all intricately interconnected. They're not separate, but they're very tightly unified, and they go together. A couple of things before we see the scene, just to understand it. A group of friends has heard conflicting gossip about whether a marriage proposal is going to be forthcoming from two characters, Howard and Bernadette. Amy, who is a neuroscientist, is going to propose a field experiment to her theoretical physicist boyfriend, Sheldon. Just a little bit of vocabulary, just to make sure we're all on the same page. They're going to use the terms meme and mimetic. And if you're familiar with this with social media, it's an element or behavior that's passed on from one individual through another. Algebraic, several definitions for this, but I use it as simply letters representing numbers combined according to the rules of arithmetic. And the third term is epidemiology, which refers to the distribution of disease and other health factors. So let's take a look at the scene, and then we'll discuss the research design or the conceptual framework on the other side.
Did I tell you our lab got a grant to study addiction?
No.
Fascinating work. I recently trained a capuchin monkey to smoke cigarettes.
Have you learned anything?
Yes. He looks much cooler than the non-smoking monkeys. Although it's not much of a contest. The other monkeys just sit around and masturbate.
If you don't mind, I'd like to stop listening to you and start talking.
By all means.
Howard has announced his intention to propose marriage to Bernadette.
I don't understand. The original piece of gossip indicated an impending breakup.
I know. The group consensus is that his proposal will be met with a humiliating, soul-crushing rejection. Everyone was set a Twitter. Although oddly, no one tweeted.
It's not surprising that the story has captured the attention of our little circle of friends. Are you familiar with meme theory?
I'm familiar with everything, but go on.
Meme theory suggests that items of gossip are like living things that seek to reproduce, using humans as their host.
I'm no stranger to mimetic epidemiology. At Johnson Elementary School, the phrase "Shelley Cooper's a smelly pooper" spread like wildfire.
I should think so. That's gold.
Your meme hypothesis does intrigue me. How might we examine this more closely?
Do you have any ethical qualms regarding human experimentation?
It's one of the few forms of interaction with people that I don't find repellent.
We need to fabricate a tantalizing piece of gossip.
And a second non-tantalizing piece to use as a control.
Then we'll track its progress through our social group and interpret the results through the competing academic prisms of mimetic theory, algebraic gossip, and epidemiology.
Look at you, getting me to engage in the social sciences. You're a vixen, Amy Farrah Fowler.
So from that scene, let's review what Amy proposed and how it fits into the conceptual framework paradigm that I use. First of all, the theoretical premises. Amy said, meme theory suggests that items of gossip are like living things that seek to reproduce, using humans as their hosts. So she was drawing from her knowledge of the research literature, and specifically a theory that would apply to the topic at hand. Her methodological premises. Now, this refers to how you're going to go about testing your, if you will, theories. She said, do you have any ethical qualms regarding human experimentation? We need to fabricate a tantalizing piece of gossip. Now, what she's proposing is a field experiment, which is sometimes used in qualitative inquiry, not all that often. But nevertheless, she's talking about how they're going to go about finding out what they wish to know. And then her epistemological premises. This is how you're going to collect and analyze your data. She said, we'll track its progress through our social group and interpret the results through the competing academic prisms of mimetic theory, algebraic gossip, and epidemiology. Most often, we use the conceptual framework by thinking about the frame. In other words, a kind of a two-dimensional picture. But I like to expand it by thinking of it in 3 dimensions. Some of you might also be asking, well, where's the ontological and the axiological as research premises? Well, first of all, the axiological refers to your value system as a researcher, what's important to you, your positionality and standpoint. For me, I feel that the axiological belongs actually in another part of your research write-up. This is your positionality statement. Granted, I will admit the axiological can affect all the other premises of the conceptual framework, but I also feel that that's sort of, if you will, represented in your choices. As far as the ontological goes, which is the nature of reality and being, I myself, and this is my particular value system, don't put that much stock into it. If you're questioning reality, you're thinking too hard, okay? You accept what's going on. All right, theoretical premises. These are the main ideas and purposes that serve as the foundations for the inquiry, and you draw upon the literature review as your primary source for finding about the schools of thought about a topic, all right? If you're going to think of the conceptual framework as something that is built, that is constructed, if you will, think of the theoretical premises as the concrete foundation for the house. This is upon which your study will be built. When it comes to the methodological premises, this is a description about how and why you're going to investigate your topic in a particular way. In other words, these are going to be the inner workings. Here in this house, for example, you see the pipes and the vents, the electrical system. These are sort of like the hidden inner workings of a house. So this kind of represents, if you will, the things that will be doing the work in your study. And when it comes time to the epistemological premises, this is how you're going to construct your knowledge about it. This is where you bring your lenses, filters, and angles in order to help inform your reader about your positionality. And this is kind of now like the frame. So that we have now the 3 facets of our conceptual framework as metaphors using the house, the concrete foundation, the inner workings, and the frame. So think of the conceptual framework as the start of something big. It's not the complete house. What it is sort of like in the older days when we had blueprints. These were the kind of 2-dimensional bird's eye view drawings of a house. Well, in a way, this could be what we're seeing on paper with our particular 2-dimensional rendering of how we're going to approach our study. But it's best to really think about your design in 3 dimensions, because this way you give your ideas a little bit more flesh. I also use Legos. This is something else I found on Facebook as another metaphor for how we're thinking about the conceptual framework. On the left side in the upper part of the screen, all these Lego pieces just jumbled together are kind of our preliminary ideas for those things for a research study that are kind of swimming in our head that we still need to put together. The theoretical premises is when we do our literature review. And here we're bringing our Legos into a little bit more organizational array based on what we find out in the literature. Perhaps maybe we put the theories in one pile, what the literature says about methods of investigation in another pile, all right? The methodological is how we're going to go about doing our study. And here's where we put our Legos in a little bit more order, stacked a little bit closer so that we get an idea about how things are coming together. The epistemological for how we're going to collect and analyze our data now. This is where we might think, okay, which items in our data are going to be, if you will, hierarchical? What is more important? What is next important? What is least important? And is there any particular order, for example, that we need to put our analyses in so that your final report is presenting the house that you have built from your study? So the research design, we're generally focusing our topic. We're making a statement of purpose. We're giving our readers a rationale for the study. And it's generally composed of a central research question and related research questions. So now let's take a look at each one of the three components of a conceptual framework. And let's start off with the theoretical. Just a definition of theory, because in my readings, I found that people didn't really define theory too well in the qualitative research books. And so I like to just simply put forth to make sure that we're all on the same page. Catherine Ralston, I think, does a wonderful, elegant definition. She said, theories are simply statements that explain how concepts connect with one another. Theories tell us something about the way things work and how things happen. So that a concrete example of a theory is what you own is who you are. In other words, material possessions reflect their owner's identity. Here are some theoretical statements about identity, and this comes from Birkenstedt's book, Identity Theory. People possess multiple identities because they occupy multiple roles, are members of multiple groups, and claim multiple personal characteristics. For each role a person plays out in a social network, there is a corresponding identity attached to it. A person's appearance provides the identities, values, moods, and attitudes of the person. Self-esteem is a direct outcome of the successful verification of an identity. Children come to define themselves in terms of how they think their parents see them. So those are 5 concrete examples of theories. Now, when it comes time to types of identity, because we're primarily focused here in education, what you see listed here are just possible types of identities you may wish to explore for the exercises that we'll be going through today. For example, if you are in leadership studies, maybe you want to focus on principal identity. If you are really geared up as a methodologist, focus on researcher identity. If you wish to explore a particular race or ethnic group, talk about, let's say, African American identity. Perhaps maybe with sexual orientation, take a look at queer identity. You can even get as specific as you wish. Like, for example, let's say queer male teachers of color identity, all right? So you can go ahead and develop what type of identity you would like to explore. So let's get, first of all, acquainted with the theoretical. What I'm going to do is read to you an overview. This is kind of like, if you will, your literature review. If you have your workbook either in print, preferably, because it's a lot easier to just circle or underline things, or if you have it in Word document, be ready to be able to do things like bold or highlight, all right? Because what I'm going to ask you to do is to listen to and select the concepts related to identity that you resonate with as a researcher for the workshop exercise. So if you have a particular type of identity in mind, go ahead and listen to these next sets of slides with that identity in mind, so that way you can sort of, if you will, listen for those things which might relate to your particular identity choice. Now, this first screen is just sort of prologue. It's not necessarily part of the literature review, but it's just to get you acquainted with the concept. The slides that follow after are your literature review. So identity is a concept or construct, process, experience, phenomenon, etc., that has multiple approaches to and definitions of it, depending on the discipline, if not the individual. The fields of psychology, sociology, anthropology, human development, education, communication, youth studies, feminist studies, cultural studies, queer studies, social media studies, visual studies, etc. Each have their own body of scholars, literature, theories, and oral traditions about what identity means and consists of. But what becomes more and less important after that depends on who is being researched and who the researcher is. Okay, here's where the literature review begins. Some will say identity is a state of being. Others will say it is exploratory, emergent, or contingent state of becoming. Some say identity is the accumulation of one's past. Others say it is how we envision ourselves in the present moment and our desired possible selves in the future. Some say identity is your individual sense of self. Others say it is how you are similar to and different from other people. But a shared identity can also exist within a small group or larger collective. Even the physical spaces and places and historic time period you occupy can influence and affect your identity. Some say identity is a label. Others say it is a symbol or metaphor. Some say identity is composed of the personal myths and stories you tell. Others say it is composed of the dialogic interpersonal relationships you have. When we identify with someone we admire, we may imitate them to assume a portion of their identity. Different identities of the same individual can exist both offline and online, suggesting that identity is real, ideal, and illusory. Yet, identities can also be micro, meso, macro, and multiple, as we experimentally switch from one role to another and then to another throughout time as part of our cognitive portfolio. An identity can be ascribed by someone to someone else, sometimes as a stereotype, yet that identity attribution can also be resisted. Personality is what you attribute to others, but an identity is what you attribute to yourself. And discovering who you are requires an introspective, reflexive self. An identity can be lost, stolen, threatened, diasporic, masked, fought for, fractured, never fully understood, adapted, improvised, or completely transformed through crises, rites, and rituals. It can consist of discrete variables, the totality of memories, cultural discourses, familial origins, or collage or mosaic of inextricable assemblages and entanglements. The in-person and social media communities to which you belong influence and shape your identity, making you feel like an insider, an outsider, or an in-betweener. Even an organization has an identity. Your education, field of study, work, and career shape how you think and what you are. Your forms of identification, name, body, wardrobe, and perceptions of them influence your sense of self. Identity consists of thoughts, feelings, images, ideologies, status, behaviors, and nationality. It can be strongly influenced by your family, age, language, social class, education, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, political affiliation, religious beliefs, and various intersectionalities. You can feel self-assured and worthy with who you are, or conflicted, unworthy, and in identity crisis. Identity can be articulated through a selfie, a social media post, and by what you create from scratch. It is a dynamic, interpersonal, and social accomplishment. Identity takes work and brings commitments and responsibilities. Some say identity is what you do. Some say it is what you value and believe. Some say it is how you perform. Some say it is how you problem solve. And others say it is what you own and consume. Some say identity can be categorized. Some say it is holistic. Some say it is constructed. Some say it is a project, and others say it is composed of multiple and shifting forms in different social contexts. Some say identity is cultural. Some say it is political. Some say it is psychological. Some say it is biological, and others say it is sociological. Still others will say it is a hybrid of some of the above, and still others will say it is some of that, but it is also something more. For the analytic components of identity are separate, but not separable. The point here is that identity exists by how it is conceptualized or operationalized and defined. So that was your trip through the library. What you're now to do is to select a type of identity you'd like to explore for workshop purposes. This is your choice about something maybe that you're interested in. Maybe it is something that's even close to you that you would like to explore. So what I'm going to ask you to do now for just a few minutes is to select and streamline the theoretical concepts related to identity that you resonate with as a researcher, and integrate them now into a primary narrative or paragraph, beginning with, for my study, identity is or means. And in your workbook on page 3, at the top, there is space for you to write that in. So in our, of course, workshop time, these are simulations. When you have more time, of course, you can spend some time reflecting on it. But just for workshop purposes, just go ahead and pen something that is a preliminary start for your exercise. For my study, blank identity is or means, and fill in the blank. So take a couple of minutes, please, to compose a couple of things, and then I'll come back. When I work with children and adolescents, I have a technique that I say, number of fingers, number of minutes. What that means is when they're working independently or if they're working in small groups, number of fingers, number of minutes means they hold up the number of more minutes they need before we go on to the next task. Like, I need 2 more minutes, or I need 0 minutes, or I need 5 more minutes. So in order to fill this prompt here, please type into the chat box, number of fingers, number of minutes. It could be 0, 1, 3, 4. And then what I do is I look at everybody's fingers and I take the average. And so far it looks like 0. The majority are saying 0. So, okay, very good. So as we go on, of course, you can keep working on developing the sentence, but just for workshop purposes, let's continue. When it comes to research design, this comes from Joseph Maxwell's book on qualitative research design, and you can see how everything is very intricately interconnected. But notice he has a separate bin for the conceptual framework, and there are all these different things that are connected to it. So it is part of the research design, but it is not completely the research design. We mentioned that in the design, we're focusing our topic, expressing our statement of purpose, developing a rationale, and developing our research questions. And this is where we're going to be focusing on now. Research questions in qualitative inquiry, to me, begin in one of 4 ways: how, what, in what ways, and why. Some people say we shouldn't be asking why questions in inquiry, and I think that's ridiculous. Why is one of the most important questions and prominent questions we ask about life. So don't be afraid to ask a why question. The graphic that you'll see on the side relates to the central research question, that primary thing that drives the entire study. And there are 5 related research questions, which are kind of sub-questions, if you will. It depends on the scope of your study, but I feel that to keep your primary research project focus, no more than 5 related research questions are recommended. Brown and Clark, who are thematic analysis methodologists, recommend that when it comes to designing research questions, we think about how we might frame them in terms of trying to understand our participants' experiences, their understandings and perceptions, what kinds of factors influence action. We take a look at people's practices or their accounts of their practices. We take a look at the rules and norms that guide social action and how we construct and represent our perceptions. So now what I'd like to ask you to do is, in your workbook on page 3, the second one is your central research question about identity. So take a look at how you could frame your central research question, and that's all, it's just one major question that begins with, how, what, in what ways, or why. If you feel that developing a central research question is a little bit kind of too formidable for you, then take a look at these recommended things that you might be able to fill in the blank with. What is blank identity? Like, what is teacher identity? How does an individual perceive their teacher identity or whatever identity you've chosen? In what ways is teacher identity constructed? Or what is the process of teacher identity development? In what ways does, let's say, school culture influence and affect a teaching group's identity? All right, so those are just some examples of prompts you might use. So now take a couple of minutes to develop a one statement or one question, central research question about identity. Go back to what you formulated from your literature review and use that as a way of helping you develop now your central research question. And what I'd like to ask you to do is type it into the chat box so that other people can see how other people frame their central research question. So as soon as you've got it, type it into the chat for other people to see. All right. And I'm just taking a look and reading what people post. Remember that a central research question to me begins with how, what, in what ways, or why. Yeah, David, good detail. Real good. Yeah, transnational identity. That's a really good concept. Athlete identity, interesting. Veteran identity, yeah. Really good, really good. And we're even going about stereotypes here. Excellent. I love working with the gifted group. These are great questions, y'all. And of course, again, for workshop purposes, we're just getting your first drafts of these research questions. When you, of course, have more time, you can refine that central research question and think about how you flesh it out with your related research questions. So far, I am really impressed with what you're putting out. Yeah. All right, keep them coming. We're going to go on, but keep them coming. Now let's take a look at the methodological, which is how we go about, let's say, those inner workings. I said it's all those wires and vents and pipes that go throughout the house. So what we're talking about is thinking of selected methodologies or genres of qualitative research that we might employ. What you see on the screen is just a brief listing of some of the major genres that are available in qualitative inquiry. And there are some amazing detailed hybrid versions of these. So you're not restricted to just these, but what I'm going to do is just talk about what might be 5 major ones that might relate to your study of identity. So now you're thinking about, okay, I've got this wonderful lit review, I've got my concept beginning of identity, and I've got a research question. Now, how am I going to go figuring this out? Some of you might decide to do an ethnography, and this includes methods for studying and documenting the culture of a group of people. So that, for example, we may want to take a look at veteran identity or veteran culture. Ethnography assumes intensive and long-term immersion in a particular field setting to become intimately familiar with the participants' ways of living and working. So what we're taking a look at are patterns and categories of natural social life, or rich or thick descriptions of interaction for how a group lives its everyday life. All right. So with an ethnography, for example, what we might do is take a look at, let's say, the culture of a school principal. And let's say we spend an entire school year with this person. There was a landmark study done by Harry Walcott called The Man in the Principal's Office. And one of the things that he recommended at the end of his study was someone needs to do a study of the woman in the principal's office. So that's one option there. We might also do an ethnography of a classroom, just as Tracy Kidder did with a 4th grade group. Here we're taking a look at spending, let's say, a semester or an academic year with a group of students in a particular classroom to see how that particular culture evolves. We might also take a look at, let's say, university culture. Rebecca Nathan, a pseudonym, did a study called My Freshman Year. And what she did was she enrolled covertly as a returning student. She was actually an anthropologist at that university and took a look at what university life was like. Another methodology that we might think about is case study. And when we're talking about case study, we're referring to a unit of one. It's not just one person. It could also be one group, one organization, one event, and so on. So what we're doing is we're taking a look at this particular case because it's either something unique, it is an opportunity, it might be a typical instance, it could be one of several other cases that will be combined with others. So it is a standalone study that addresses the research questions of interest. For example, Marisol Clark-Ibanez did a beautiful case study about two students. One, Patty, who was a Latina, who was getting in trouble in school all the time. But it was a beautiful portrait of one young girl. I believe she was in fourth grade. We might do a case study of an exemplary teacher and take a look at his or her practice so that we find out, for example, like Tracy Kidder did with that one particular fourth grade teacher. Here we take a look at one particular practice. It could be, let's say, a veteran teacher with maybe 15 years of experience. It could be a first year teacher and her or his trials as she learns what it's like. We might do a case study of a particular school so that that entire unit, for example, becomes something that we explore with all its different facets, faculty, students, staff members, and so forth. Grounded theory is another methodology that we might explore with our identity study, because grounded theory is a systematic methodological approach to qualitative research. It constructs a theory from the ground up. It's an inductive and iterative process of collecting your data, coding, categorizing, and analytic memo writing in order to arrive at a central or core category to help explain the phenomenon of investigation. In other words, with this particular exercise, we're taking a look at developing a theory about your particular identity choices. I would love to do, or would like someone to do a grounded theory study about parents. So that, for example, how do they, for example, involve themselves in their children's education? How do they involve themselves with the school? We might do grounded theory about a particular subject area or a population. For example, girls in mathematics. What are the theories that perhaps maybe helps them with their process in developing, let's say, a math identity? We could also do a grounded theory based on, let's say, a particular subject area. Again, here, like, for example, a reading group and how the teacher interacts with, and what are the theories of helping children develop literacy. Phenomenology, you take a look at the graphic, it's somebody looking inside someone's mind. And this is kind of what phenomenology is all about. The way it's evolved in qualitative inquiry is studying the nature and the states of lived experiences. So we're using primarily, but not exclusively, interview data to try to capture the essences and essentials of what something means to a group of participants. Most phenomenological inquiries are framed with research questions that begins with what is or are, such as what is the nature of belonging? What does it mean to belong? What are the lived experiences of belonging? One of my mentors, Mary Lee Smith, did a phenomenology about teachers' meanings of test preparation. What she did was she took a look at the way teachers prepared their students for those high stakes tests. And so what she was trying to find out is, what does it mean to teachers? We might take a look at the phenomenology of, let's say, what does it mean to discipline, or what does it mean to manage student behavior? We can also take a look at the phenomenology of what does it mean to be, let's say, a male elementary school teacher. So as long as we're phrasing our phenomenological studies with what does it mean, then we're on good ground. Autoethnography is a relatively recent genre of qualitative inquiry. And as you can see, what we're doing is we're taking a look at ourselves in the mirror. We're asking the researcher to return a reflexive gaze toward oneself. This is an artistic and analytic demonstration of how we come to know, name, and interpret personal and cultural experience. So autoethnography is not just a first-person biographical narrative. The ethnography part of it suggests that you're taking a look at your personal ways of living and your particular culture or your value, attitude, and belief systems. So autoethnography is the introspective examination of one's culture through a culture of one's experience. It has been colloquially called not research, but me-search. For example, if you are a principal or a district person, you may want to do an autoethnography about what it is like to be in that leadership role. If you are a student, you might ask that student to, for example, do an autoethnography about their own particular experiences with a particular passionate uh, love of a subject. Like, for example, we might ask this adolescent girl, what is it, what is being a musician all about to you? Why is being a musician so important to you? I would love to get the stories and perspectives of school staff members, which we don't do enough of, for those custodians, janitors, cafeteria workers, for example, people who work behind the desk in the office, have them tell us their particular stories, because I think that that gets us even deeper to understanding what school culture is all about. So now in your workbook on page 3, about in the middle now, what would be a most appropriate methodological study for you to choose that's going to harmonize with your theoretical concepts thus far and your central research question? So that, for example, let's say that you're taking a look at, let's say, teacher identity. Well, then perhaps maybe you can take a look at it as a case study. Or if you are currently a teacher in practice in some way, an autoethnography to take a look at your own teacher identity. So thank you, Jillian, for that reference. I would love to that. Thank you. I appreciate. By the way, use the chat box if you feel that there's a question that got posed and you have an answer or response to it. Please feel free to do that. We are part of a learning community. I'm not the one with all the answers. You've got some expertise too. For right now, though, fill in that worksheet the methodology or methodologies that will best harmonize with the theoretical concepts that you've chosen about identity from the literature review, and something that will harmonize with your central research question. I like to get a reality check sometimes when I do online workshops. Please post in the chat box things like, yes, thumbs up, got it, I know what to do, things like that. Or let me know if I need a little bit more clarification or I need a little bit more direction. So if you could please post in the chat box, do you know what to do? Or do you need a little bit more help? All right, checking something came by. Okay, good, good, good. All right. So it seems like most people, can you choose more than one methodology? Absolutely. I have seen, just as a hybrid example, critical feminist ethnography. That's an example of combining 3 different methodologies for one study. So yes, you can adopt more than one methodology for your study. Okay, so take just a couple of minutes now to pen down what methodology you would choose for your study. The combination of methodologies. I've seen a study that the researcher labeled critical feminist ethnography. In other words, she was studying the culture. I'm trying to remember. I think it was some kind of support group for women, and she stayed with them. I'm afraid I don't remember the study, but I remember she stayed with them throughout the course of about maybe 6 months. And so, she would attend the support meetings, and what she did was she took a critical lens to her study, so that it wasn't just documenting the culture of this a particular women's group, but it was taking a look at it from a critical perspective about what the women were, discussing. And I think it was, what was it? I believe it was about violence, domestic violence, something along those lines. So that's just an example of how we can combine hybrid methodologies. Yes, feel free to post your methodological choices in the chat box so that people can see your thinking and see how it compares with theirs. Yeah, Saber, there is a thing called ethnographic case study. Yes. And remember the conceptual framework, it's not an anchor, it is a compass. You can change things as your study evolves, as your game plan evolves. Oh, duo ethnography. Good for you. I'm glad you know that methodology. And teacher action research. Yes, yes. Difference between content and thematic analysis. Content analysis is looking for primarily the what is there, the general contents of the data set. It's primarily descriptive. Thematic analysis is when you're doing a more interpretive read of the data so that you're taking a look at patterns, not just numbers or descriptions. That was a very quick, broad brushstroke explanation. I apologize if it wasn't clear, but just simply given the limitations of time that we have, I was just giving you a kind of just a little button of it. All right, as we say, moving on. Let's take a look now at the epistemological section of the conceptual framework. Here now is how we're thinking about how we're going to collect the data. And Brown and Clark, by the way, I'd recommend we should really be using the term generate the data. I kind of like that, so I'm beginning to use that term a little bit more often. So when it comes time to thinking about now your literature review, your central research question, and your methodological choices, how are you going to get that story? First of all, you have available to you participant observation. This is where you're spending some time taking a look at social life as it naturally occurs. And there are different degrees of participant observation. You can be a very active participant in the role, or you can have that fly, on the wall kind of stance where you don't interrupt the action, but you're really just recording it. Interviews and focus groups. It's said that interviews are probably the most frequent type of data collected. However, social media, Zoom interviews are going to be sort of, if you will, kind of putting a little bit of a dent into that figure. But nevertheless, when we talk to people, we can do it live, we can do it in focus groups, we can do it over Zoom. However you can get people's perspectives. This is their first person perspective. Documents are also another way of taking a look at how we construct knowledge and, in fact, how we think about the identity, because we can read things that people have created and written, and we can make some inferences, logical inferences about what their identity is like based on how they compose and how they write. Artifacts, the theory goes, what you own is who you are. So that if we were to take a look, for example, at just the artifacts of this particular teacher's desk, we would make some inferences about what is important to them. We would make inferences, for example, about, how messy are they? How neat are they? How structured are they? So that's another example of how we might think about identity in terms of what the personal space is like. of course, visual and digital materials, taking a look at how a person expresses themselves on social media, particularly with selfies. That's a very intriguing way of taking a look at identity. Do they create original art, for example? We can take a look at the photographs that we may ask them to take or that they take and that they post about their lives. There's also the other or all is data. That's Barney Glazier's famous phrase. We can use such things as surveys, statistics, related literature, even our own personal experiences. Even if the study is not about us exclusively, we can bring our personal experiences as data into the mix. So we have a wide array of different types of data collection methods. Now, in addition to that, we have to analyze these data. And this is not a workshop in data analysis, but this is just an overview about the different types of approaches that you might use for analyzing the story. So now in your workbook on page 3, there is a section for how you can think about how you're going to generate the data and how you are going to analyze it. So just do some quick thinking here based on everything that you've done thus far. What would be the most appropriate ways of generating your data? And what might be the most appropriate ways of analyzing the data? I know that there are lots of different approaches, and you may or may not be familiar with these analytic approaches. But if you're not familiar, if you're new to qualitative inquiry, don't worry too much about this. Really think about what would be the best way of getting the story. All right. Why is the term generate preferable to collect when discussing the gathering of data? Because Brown and Clark said in one of their webinars, we as researchers don't just get it, but what we're doing is we're actually, if you will, we are part of the data generation process. In other words, the researcher is very active. If you go back to the term data, the original meaning of data is something given. Well, in a way, think of data as a gift that a participant gives to us. All right. That, for me, sort of says, I need to cherish what the participant tells me, gives me, creates for me. Right. So just spend a couple of minutes now penning down some ideas. The best data for autoethnography, personal journals. And other people who have done autoethnographies have interviewed people who were closely related to themselves so that they could get different perspectives. Other people have created original art because sometimes writing the story, sometimes words obfuscate what it is that we're trying to say. And so they will create original art as if to say, this is who I am, or this is what's going through my mind visually. And I love the idea that people are posting their choices in the chat. That gives us an idea about the way other people are thinking about research design. Nice, Crystal. Yeah, good ideas, good ideas. Photo voice, absolutely, yeah. Okay, keep them coming. I'm going to progress forward with the slides. When it comes time to thinking about how we develop our conceptual framework, it's not just a narrative, it can also be a visual diagram. So that here, for example, my visual diagram for a conceptual framework is just very simple with a Venn diagram. We can use visual models to supplement our written text. It doesn't just stand on its own. We use the diagram both as a way of helping to reach our ideas, but also as a way of documenting our ideas. And the visual diagram, just like the narrative, evolves throughout the study. For example, when I was doing a case study of an exemplary language arts teacher, one of the things I did was to think about not just her, but what influences her practice. And so on the right side of the page, I was thinking about all the different people who could be in one way or another influencing her. Well, this is a very linear diagram that doesn't give, if you will, much prominence with how things are, some things are more influential than others. So as the study progressed and I did interviews with the teacher and I watched her classroom, I began to realize that perhaps the most prominent thing, no surprise, were the state standards and testing as the most influential factor on her practice. But yet I also learned that the state mandated textbooks influenced her curriculum, but also she was very well served by her district in-service teacher ed workshops. She found them very helpful. She also had a very supportive school principal, and of course, naturally, her interactions with students. The bottom ones were those things that are actually kind of peripheral to her practice. Certainly, the state school board and the state school superintendent were influential in the state standards and testing development and mandates, but nevertheless, they were kind of peripheral. It was actually the test itself that was most important. So this is how we go from something that might be a first draft kind of, if you will, placeholders conceptual framework. As the study progressed, this is what it evolved into. Other examples of conceptual frameworks that I pulled from the literature, and you have the links so that if you wish to learn a little bit more about them, they're there on the screens. We can take a look at how teacher identity is divided into three different facets: the professional, the sociocultural, and the personal. So that here, for example, in their particular conceptual framework, they're showing how the narrative and the diagram work together. We can take a look at how a conceptual framework derives from the literature about what creates a good relationship between a teacher and a student. And they called it engagement orientation or disaffection orientation. So that, for example, if the teacher really knew the student very well, their history, their past work in school, their parents, what excites them, then you were developing a really good developmental alliance. But if the teacher really didn't know that much about the student, didn't if sometimes even know their name, there's a rejection of the teacher relationship. This relates to school teachers as change agents. When the principal is involved in particular ways of learning about their job, learning about not just their job, but also about what it takes to create change, then they were able to see how is the principal as a change agent in their school. My cat will sometimes tell me as I'm talking aloud, no, please go on. Your conceptual framework sounds fascinating. So my original study, my very first ethnography, this was published in 1997. The language and terms are out of date. Inner city, we prefer the term urban now. But what I did was my first ethnographic study was taking a look at a white teacher's conception of drama with urban Hispanic youth. So this was a teacher, her first 2 years of practice, learning what it was like to work with a school that was 98% Hispanic. What I did was my theoretical framework was taking a look at anthropology's cultural shock and adaptation model, where the teacher came in very excited as a tourist, her first teaching job, but the crisis, she didn't know the language, Spanish language. And so she had to adjust by learning, for example, more Spanish vocabulary, finding out which students could translate for her until she had a little bit of successful adaptation. However, she did not become fluent in Spanish. Sometimes she just merely acculturated to it. And acculturation means I'll live with it, but I won't necessarily like it or get along all that well. but yet it's cyclical. Other crises occur. There was a strong gang presence in her school. And whenever there were like drills or shootings in the neighborhood, she had to learn how to adjust to that kind of culture and climate. So my own conceptual framework narrative, I'm only just going to read a portion of it because I want more time for you to develop your own narrative. First of all, in the conceptual framework narrative, you don't have to limit it to where here are my theoretical premises first, then here are my methodological, here are my epistemological. You can interweave them all the way throughout. So here was the beginning in my research report, what my conceptual framework narrative was all about. Teacher folklore and professional literature in education are replete with examples of beginning teachers who experience culture shock and learn how to survive in inner city schools. Nancy's problems and perceptions as a white first-year teacher in a predominantly Hispanic school were typical of those in similar situations reported in the research literature. This study adopts the interpretive inquiry paradigm and methods of Erickson, which state that significant participant actions embedded in social and cultural contexts can be observed and interpreted by the researcher who attempts to make meaning of them from the participant's point of view. Also adopted are the methodological caveats of Stanfield and Anderson, which state that multi-ethnic qualitative research is inherently political and emotion-laden for the participants, researchers, and readers. Thus, emotional engagement and self-reflection by the researcher of color during all phases of the study are not considered biasing, but essential qualities for social insight. All right, so I continue on in my narrative talking about how, for example, my own ethnicity plays a role in my analysis of this particular study. I continue to bring in, though, the theoretical premises that, for example, Grant and Tate, Marin and Marin say, I need, my ethnic background as a prerequisite for this particular case study. Now, notice how even statements can interweave all three components of the conceptual framework. Here I say, Anderson asserts that there can be no colorblind stance in qualitative work of this nature. Minority group members have insights about and interpretations of their experiences that are likely different from those generated by white scholars. So sometimes it's kind of difficult to separate the three. That's why I have the Venn diagram that shows their overlap and interconnectedness and interrelationships. So from this cultural shock model, I adapted this with this particular case study to show how Martinez school culture, dealing with all the Hispanic children and the different things that they brought into it, affected and influenced her conception of drama and her philosophy, curriculum, and practice. I acknowledge that I'm kind of speed reading through all of this. Of course, you have the PDF of all these slides, so you can look at them at your leisure. All right. So now I'm going to ask you to pull everything that we've done thus far into a conceptual framework for a qualitative study about identity, but you're going to be doing the Reader's Digest version. So you've seen how what you're going to be doing is interweaving the three different facets that you've explored thus far and penned thus far. So your narrative is going to take a look now at, excuse me, I just need to make sure I get on the right page. So you're now going to take a look at how you can weave together the theoretical, methodological, and epistemological. This is the investigative architecture for your study, where your theoretical is your foundation for the house. The methodological are those inner workings, how you're going to go about doing that study. And the epistemological is how are you going to construct the knowledge from the data that you've collected and analyzed. All right, so you've got a lot of different things to consider in how they all come together. And one of the easiest ways that I found that I've used with my students is to put them into what is called the 3-minute or the 1-page research proposal. On the final page of your handout, of your workbook on page 5, this is where you can just put together now, not a quick and dirty, but an in-progress game plan for your conceptual framework for your study of identity. And all you need to do is to just fill in the blank. This comes from Lynn Richards' book, Handling Qualitative Data. She uses this as a way of helping her students get a handle on pulling the different pieces together. So what you're going to do is you're going to be briefly talking about what your theoretical says. The research literature suggests, and this is where you put in your facets of identity. Your methodological or your central research question is, so I'm asking, and you plug in what your central research question is. Number 3, your methodological rationale. It matters because, and this is why you're telling your reader why it's important to do this particular study. The other, number 4, methodological and epistemological combined together, is how you're going to collect, generate, and analyze your data. I plan to answer my central research question by, and this is where you say, I'm going to conduct an ethnography where I'm going to collect interviews of the teachers, I'm going to conduct participant observation of their classrooms, etc. And then number 5 is where you're talking about the knowledge transfer. Who is it going to be useful for? Is it going to be useful for beginning teachers? Is it going to be useful for people who are in leadership programs? Is it going to be useful for policy development? So here now is where you begin to fill in the blanks for your research study. So take some time now, pull it all together. Rough draft, first draft, doesn't have to be perfect. All right, but just pen the ideas. All right, let's take some time to work on your own, and then we'll come back. That was just a very brief amount of writing time. I acknowledge you may not have finished, but that's okay. If you wish to explore this exercise on your own, yes, you certainly can, and I encourage you to. For right now, I'd like to know if I could get one volunteer to read aloud what they have penned down on page 5 of their workbook. We acknowledge that this is just in progress. Raise your hand if you have the raise hand function, or just turn on your microphone and say, I volunteer, so that we can just hear just one example of a conceptual framework in progress. David, thank you for volunteering. Please turn on your mic. And when we're finished, I'll give you some snaps. Let's hear what you're doing and exploring.
Okay. Yeah, work in progress here. So like the theoretical part, is it all right if I just go through each one? Is it the correct way to do it here?
Just read as
Okay.
you've written it down.
Okay. Yeah. So for one, the theoretical or lit review, I have like the research literature suggests Black students and students of color in general do better in school when they are taught in a manner that validates their identity and culture and sees them as intelligent, as well as when they're in a school environment that gives them opportunities to connect with their peers, express themselves and their interests, and create networks of support and safe spaces. Then for methodological, so what I'm asking is, I have a few questions that I'm kind of working around, and those are, what conditions and actions in a predominantly white school allow Black students to succeed and thrive? How do Black students create their own sense of belonging in a predominantly white school? And what actions do schools and teachers take to create a sense of belonging for their Black students? For methodological rationale, I said it matters because Black students make up a significant number of students in America's public schools. They've also faced the most barriers, and many measurements of school success indicate that the current system is not working as well for them as for other racial groups. If we want to have a school system where everyone can thrive, their success is essential. For methodological, epistemological, I put the I would conduct interviews, collect data about student participation in various aspects of the school process, both like curricular and extracurricular, and then use like coding of that data, analytic memos to make sense of it, look for patterns and themes. And then as far as like, I didn't actually get to number 5. Sorry, that's where I left off.
That's all right. That's all right. But boy, I sure do find it useful. I mean, the transferability is a given because it's just so relevant and important. Giving you snaps here. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, David. What I loved about it was a wonderful unity. In other words, I really saw a wonderful flow from one idea to another. So you've really gotten a nice, the only word I can think of it is unity. And that for me is what a conceptual framework is all about. That comes together. So I really love the way that you put that. So yeah, well-deserved applause that I see in the chat. Time is my enemy, so I'm going to rush through. So what we've done is we've explored the conceptual framework as part of 3 facets: the theoretical, the methodological, and the epistemological. If you wish to learn more about it, take a look at these particular resources, especially Ravitch and Riggins' Reason and Rigor book, because what they do is they really spend the whole book just exclusively on how conceptual frameworks will guide research. Still confused? Don't worry, give yourself time to reflect. I told you it took me a year to really understand what the conceptual framework was all about. So if you need a little bit more time for it to sort of sink in your head, give yourself that time. Time is always our enemy. First of all, just if you wish to use these slides for any kind of purposes, for teaching and learning, you are more than welcome to. Please do not reproduce the slides, though, because they are from third-party sources. So don't put any of these slides in a journal. So it gives me great joy to know that these slides are being used to teach. We have just about 5 minutes for questions. I can stay a little bit longer after that if you can, but if you need to leave at the top of the hour, that's fine. When it comes to questions, if you posted something in chat earlier, I may have missed it. So if you can please either repost it in the chat or just turn on your microphone and ask it. Let's see what kind of things might be going through your mind. All right.
I'll raise one that was brought up a little bit earlier from someone in the chat. and then someone
Uh-huh.
else in the room can add more questions. I think it was Elizabeth Morgan asked. This is when you were first introducing the breakdown in the Venn diagram. So Elizabeth asked, thank you for that breakdown. For those that use theoretical frameworks that include epistemology, such as CRT frameworks, how should they be separated in the Venn diagram? Like I'm thinking like counter storying is like an approach, right, of engaging in CRT. And so that has some epistemological premises. So where would you put that in the Venn diagram is her question.
Yeah, what came to my mind when you were talking about that is there's a portion in the Venn diagram where the methodological and the epistemological overlap. There's that section. That's where that belongs, because I think you're bringing in both your methodology of CRT, critical race theory, I'm assuming is what your CRT means, and also the idea of how you collect that data. So remember, everything is, even though it looked like I was presenting it in a very structured 3-part way, everything that I've discussed thus far is so fluid and so malleable. Ours is designer research, right? So that we have great leeway in the design of our conceptual framework. What other questions or topics might be going through your mind?
I think one of the other questions that had come in asked about why is the term generate preferable to collect when discussing the gathering of data?
Yeah, I love the terminology of it because the researcher becomes a more active part of the process. In other words, if I'm collecting, it's being given to me. Okay, that's great. But now what do I do with that data that have been given to me? I start generating it through transcripts, through field notes, through documents, putting it in, processing it into certain files. So what I'm doing is I'm not just collecting the data, but I'm doing something with it. I'm generating it into new forms. So I think that's the rationale that Brown and Clark came up with.
So we're going to try to voice some of these questions for people. Here's
Yeah.
another one from the chat. How might one distinguish a conceptual framework from a theoretical framework?
Yeah, the theoretical framework is just that red portion at the top of the diagram. Some people will, again, use the terms interchangeably, especially conceptual framework and theoretical framework. It's like category and theme. They'll mix up those terms and use one or the other. And it's the same thing with conceptual and theoretical framework. The theoretical framework relies primarily on the literature review, what the theories about your particular topic have said, and that becomes the primary driver for your study. It doesn't really concern itself, if you will, with how you're going to use a particular genre or use a particular data generation method. That's sort of like, a separate discussion. So that's how I differentiate between the two. Go back to one of the earlier slides, and I think I have a very specific definition for theoretical framework. I think that'll help clarify.
One of the other questions that came into the Q&A earlier, as you were talking about the conceptual framework, there was some sort of a linearity to it in the way you were talking about it. But if you perhaps had to prioritize on consideration when beginning to develop a conceptual framework, what might it be? Is there a specific starting point, or does it vary? And what are some of the considerations that you may prioritize throughout?
Yeah, we might teach design in a very linear way, research design, but you know as well as I, if you've done any kind of research studies, you do a literature review that informs your methodology, and then you do some more literature review, then that's going to affect your, conceptual framework diagram. Everything is very back and forth and iterative in research design. It's never a pure linear kind of step-by-step approach. So when it comes time to that, that's just the way it works. All right. And that's kind of both the beauty and the curse of it. It's not formulaic or algorithmic. It's heuristic, which means a method of discovery.
And I see one here too, from Jordan, who was asking, first of all, if you get a chance, read these chats, Johnny. This is people are very, very grateful for your generosity and your expertise.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Jordan was asking, I have a question about positionality. How do epistemology and axiology work together and work differently to inform the positionality of a researcher?
The more I think about it, no, never mind what I just said. When I take a look at the more recent journal articles, positionality statements are becoming more and more prominent in the research write-up. It's usually no more than 1 to 2 paragraphs just right before the discussion of the findings. And so I like that idea that it is a separate component of a research study. It tells me where the researcher is coming from, and it kind of establishes an informal contract between me as the reader and the researcher. The axiological helps inform your positionality statement. And granted, when you tell me what your research study is all about, like for example, when David gave us that beautiful outline of his research study in progress, I could tell what he valued just from the inferences. He values multicultural education. He values African American students. He values making schools a better place to learn. So I was learning a lot about his axiology already, just from what he was telling me about the 3 components of his research design. So that is me. Depending on who you read, depending on who your teacher is, they're going to say, no, your axiology is part of your conceptual framework. The way that I taught it to you today, that's my signature method to approaching it. Mine is not the way, it's just one way.
That's great. There's some sharing of resources in the chat too. Viraj, did you see another question?
Thank you so much for your positive energy and your contributions. I appreciate presenting this, and I hope that you take this and spread the word. I love it when knowledge gets spread.
It's wonderful. Thank you. So I do see the questions. There's people are asking about the recording. So we put it in the chat, but just to let everyone know, on the Education Now Lab website, we will be able to take this recording. Again, thank you to Johnny Saldaña for allowing us to do that. And the resources from today's session will be there. There are 2 previous series as well. So we did a 2022 theory method series, and there's a great session on positionality. I know that some people are sharing some resources there. An article from Lee Patel and Cari de los Rios is posted there as well. So that's a place to go if you're looking for some of these other resources and continue with that. So one last time, we'd like to thank Johnny Saldaña for joining us tonight. And so just a snaps, a round of applause. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith.
You bet.